Good morning. So I just got a signal from the back. We're going to start now. Thank you for coming to the Cyber Investing Summit. My name is Steve Morgan. I cover cybersecurity for Forbes, and I also run a market research firm, Cybersecurity Ventures. I'm going to take about 10 minutes just to open up the summit. Originally, I was thinking about offering my view on cyber. I talked to a lot of people, and then I thought better of it. And I think what I will do is just share with you some important market figures that will really frame what we're here to talk about today, the cybersecurity industry. So really, the four things that I'll speak to are cybersecurity spending globally, cybercrime, employment figures, and investment capital. And I think those 4 points will kind of frame what we're all here to talk about today. I'll give you my email address just quickly, because I'm going to cite a lot of numbers that are very well researched, but if I share my source for each statistic, then I'll spend a half an hour talking. But I'm happy to reply back to anybody and give you the source of any of the data that I share. So it's steve@cybersecurityventures.com. So, the broadest framing of the market would be spending. I wouldn't say necessarily, that's at the top of the list. You might say that cybercrime, drives spending. Certainly it does. But let's just start with spending. According to forecasts, and when I say forecasts, these are things that we look very carefully at. I might look at 12 or 15, sometimes as many as 20 or 25 different reports and forecasts, synthesize that information, so I'm not just repeating one thing that I saw in one publication. You could pretty much hang your hat on these numbers as being fairly broad but accurate depictions of the cyber industry. So the worldwide market for cybersecurity, which would be products and services, was $75 billion last year, 2015. It's expected to grow to $170 billion by 2020. The $75 billion number, that is worth mentioning. That does come from Gartner, but it also comes from probably about 6 or 7 other sources who report around Gartner who may have adjusted those numbers, right? So that's, kind of, the general spending that we're looking at on cyber. What I will say is sort of a one-off, and we'll get to this a little bit later in the summit, and this would just be in my own personal opinion, I don't believe that includes IoT security. And I've asked a lot of questions. People haven't been able to answer those questions. When I say people, I mean analysts. I talked to Forrester, I talked to Gartner, I talked to, probably a dozen or so people who cover cyber, and no one's been able to really give me a straight answer on that as far as their numbers and their forecasts, understandably, because the market's growing so quickly. PC, IoT, mobile security. If you look at that cumulatively, right, so when I say $170 billion by 2020, that means in the year 2020, $170 billion will be spent, but you're looking at about $700 billion, $750 billion, maybe $800 billion in cybersecurity spending over the next 5 years, to give you sort of a broad sense of how much money is being spent in this market. So what's driving it? Arguably cybercrime, right? Some may agree, some may not agree. I think it's a combination of 2 things. I think it's a combination of cybercrime and then the fear of cybercrime, or the fear of being a big bank and not doing something about it because the spotlight's on you. So there's a lot of market dynamics right now. Last year, Lloyd's, the British insurance company, had published a report saying that cybercrime costs businesses globally on the order of $400 to $450 billion. And then about 6 months later, they updated that and said that it was $525 billion. So just to give you sort of a general idea of the market numbers around cybercrime. Juniper Research recently released a report. You may want to just Google it. If you just Google Juniper Research Cybersecurity Report, it's one of the best reports out there. They forecast that the cost of breaches will quadruple and reach $2 trillion by 2020. Whether you believe that or not, there's some compelling data in the report, and I would encourage everybody to read through that. The cybercrime numbers that are published don't include unreported breaches, of course, right? So you have to think about, is that twice the number? Is it 10 times the number? Cybercrime is a little bit more difficult to tally than street crime. So, street crime, you have dead bodies, you know how many murders were committed. With breaches, it's a little bit different. But those are some cybercrime numbers. Employment. Going into 2016, we had approximately 1 million cybersecurity job openings. Now, that's a global figure, worldwide. In the US, there were about 210,000 unfilled positions. So that's sort of what the job opportunity market looked like. But we have an epidemic. We have a shortage of cyber workers. It's getting worse, not better. It's forecast to reach 1.5 million by 2019. And you can speculate on, why do we have that epidemic? What's the problem? I can offer up quickly what I view as being some of the problems based on, some data. I'll start out with our colleges here in the US, universities. The top 10 university programs offering a computer science major, which of course is a very popular major, requires that students take a total of 0 cybersecurity courses to earn a degree. So, we're not educating our young people. Now, of course, you can go back and you can take a look at high school and, you could, kind of go back, to, what kids are learning about cyber today, but we're not graduating people with sufficient cyber experience to fill those jobs. Women in cyber, it's nice to see, we have an audience of women here. I can't really count and do the tally, but I'll just guess that, it's probably a lot less than the number of men that are in the room, and that's a reflection of the cyber industry, unfortunately. Women make up 50% of the world population. They make up 50% of the workforce in the US. They make up less than 11% of the workers in cyber. And interestingly, women make up about 25% of IT workers. So why don't we have more women in the cyber workforce? That's something that we need to figure out, we need to tap into. So, college kids, college graduates, women in cyber, minorities is even worse. Hispanics, African American, you're looking at about 3% who hold information security analyst positions. Right? So, we need to figure out how do we engage our whole population of college graduates, our whole population of the female population, because it's just going to keep getting worse. And that really is plaguing the industry. Anything we talk about today, why is there cybercrime? It all gets back to an epidemic, a labor shortage in the cyber field. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more today. Investment capital, the last point, and then we'll get the first panel started. I often, get the question, how much money is flowing into cyber? How big is cyber? Is cyber hot? I think a lot of people are here today, wanting to look at, the investment side of things. I'll just share some statistics with you, some numbers, some observations, and then, hopefully the panel will really dig in today. There was about $7.5 billion, maybe just a little bit less than that, maybe between 7.3 and $7.4 billion invested into about 1,000 cybersecurity companies for the 5-year period 2010 to 2015. And that would go through the middle of 2015. So I don't have numbers, that would kind of update 2015. In 2014, the numbers were about $2.5 billion. So obviously, it's really starting to trend up. I've been in the security space a long time. 15 years ago, if you were a cybersecurity company and you raised $5 million, that was a lot of money. Most of the raises were in the single digits. Now it's not uncommon to see a cybersecurity company raising $50 million, $100 million. We're going through what I think is a cycle right now. I've heard talk on the street, cyber's slowing up. We're not seeing as many investments right now. And to an extent, that's true. I think there were about half the number of companies funded in the second half of 2015, but the numbers aren't out, so I don't want to quote anything. But my personal opinion is that investors have stood back and they're thinking more strategically. So we went through this hype cycle where everybody wanted to get into cyber for one reason or another. And I could stand here for an hour, kind of giving a big talk on that, but I won't. But I think that investors now are stepping back, and it's evidenced by funds that we haven't seen before. Just in the past year, even though cyber has, quote, slowed up, there have been 3 VC firms who have launched $100 million plus funds. One launched a $200 million fund exclusively to invest into cyber. So you can't measure the activity exclusively by how many companies have been funded. You have to take a look at, what are the VCs thinking? How much money are they sitting on that they've allocated to cyber? Because that money is going to flow. It's cyclical. So I think we're going to see, a very big year, second half of 2016 through 2017. We're seeing that. Just a couple of points on investment, and then I'm going to kind of wrap up. Everything that I'm talking about is global, although a lot of it is concentrated here in the US. And we're going to talk today about, other parts of the world, but I'll just quickly touch on one. That would be Israel. They are the world's second largest exporter of cybersecurity. Not a lot of people know that. It's a tiny nation, and it's remarkable. And we're starting to see funds exclusively in Israel. Duet Partners just closed, I think it was a $75 or $80 million fund exclusively to invest into Israeli companies. I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm going to say something on the order of 80% of what they export is to the US government. So, don't write that down. Don't write down 80%, but you could write down a lot and then, research it yourself. So they're definitely an ally. They're definitely a friend and a very large exporter. I talk to a lot of people about cybersecurity, and cybersecurity investing and VCs are interchangeable. When you talk about, investment capital, no matter who I talk to, they talk to me about angels, they talk to me about VC firms, the obvious investors. The less obvious investors are some of the biggest investors in cyber. For those of you who don't know it, the single largest cybersecurity investor in the world is Intel Capital. It's not a VC firm. It's not, some of the big names you're familiar with, and that's not to take anything away from them, but Intel is the single largest investor. Google is, I know they're in the top 10. I don't know if they're 6, 7, or 8, but they're right up there too. Behind that, you have Qualcomm and, probably about a dozen companies who would be, probably top 50 investors in cyber. So that's definitely a source of capital for any young entrepreneur here starting up a cyber firm to look at. So with that said, I guess we'll start the first panel. Yes?
Quick question. One of the reasons there's such an epidemic of labor shortage is because cyber workers are treated like crap. So what's going on in the world to change the culture of that?
Well, I can't really comment on that because I don't know if your commentary is specific to your employer or...
Not at all. People I mentored.
I don't know that I'd really want to comment on that. I talk to a lot of people in cyber, and some of them are thrilled to be where they are, and they're very happy and excited about the opportunity, and others are disillusioned. It doesn't seem to me to be all that different than any other job, whether it's in tech or...
Let me ask the question a different way. Because senior management of most companies are a different generation and are understandably wary and insecure about the fact that they don't understand it, they don't listen, they don't pay proper heed, they don't pay proper respect just by accident.
Right. It is. I mean, again, I think it's situational. I think we're seeing a changing of the guard. There's always a different perspective on things. Take, for instance, government workers. People say that government workers are underpaid, especially in cyber. And on the one hand, that's true. And for anyone here who, does work for our government, thank you, because without you, we wouldn't have a government. We wouldn't have the country that we have. But what I'll say is some of the highest paid people in cyber have crossed over from government. So they've paid their dues. They've learned a lot. So I think sometimes it's just a matter of perspective. You make a good point. Certainly, there's a lot of ignorance around cyber.